Thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you, Tito. Thank you to the Fondazione De Benedetti for this occasion. It's an honor to be here for anyone, but as Sarah said, especially for a proud Bocconi graduate, myself. I'm not making this about myself, but forgive me, give me 1 minute here. The years in Bocconi were created such a community that, in fact, one of my classmates, Alessandro, is here. So I'm also honored to have here my family. Between my parents, me and my brother, 3 Bocconi graduates. So there we go. My son is here. No hints, no hints. I also want to say, kind of before getting to the earnest, I spent 5 years at Harvard and 20 plus years at Berkeley. From a distance, to see what Bocconi has done in 25 years is really spectacular. And I am a little partisan, but I root for different European institutions. You witness wonderful researchers everywhere, but the growth in the building, the faculty, the students from what already was a special institution is something that I know how hard it is, having witnessed firsthand, say, the work of my father at the Polytechnique and trying to do my part at Berkeley. And I kind of really want to salute some of the people here who've been part of that, from Francesco here and many others, because it really is a special thing. So thank you, and let me get started on this. So probably many of you have heard something about behavioral economics. So one of the fields that behavioral economics has done is it used the microscope of the lab to study, for example, do people have self-control problems? Do they care about fairness? And it came up with models of that. And then over time, as behavioral economists, we started seeing how does that impact choices of savings plans, pensions or health plans or competition when consumers are behavioral. Now, until recently though, behavioral economists have been very cautious to talk about policy. And in many ways it makes sense. It kind of would be unwise to run to policy before you really were thorough enough about understanding those features of human behavior and the evidence. So the order is the right one. And behavioral economists were wanted in particular to sort of take it one step at a time. But in the last 15 years, there's been a lot of interest, in part, especially since the Nudge book by Nobel laureate Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein, who worked in the Obama White House, in understanding how far can we take the lessons about human behavior. So behavioral economists basically is like saying enriching with notions from psychology, the textbook model of economists, which if you took the classes I took 30 years ago, everybody was taking classes. Homo economicus is not at all like us. It's like reads all the footnotes and makes perfect decisions and always resists the ice cream and so on. And we know that people were not made like that, and which makes life more interesting and makes predicting economic decisions a little more complicated. So the question is it justified to have a lecture today about behavioral economics and public policy? Are we up to something? Okay? And more substantively, what policies could be affected by behavioral economics? Anything of first order relevance? And if you allow me, what may be some of the frontiers at the field? What are some of the questions that are looming for us to address for the next generation, for example? Okay. So here's what I want to try to do today. I want to try to start from a National Academies report that I was part of to say, what are the main models of forces in behavioral economics? In a way, that's kind of a 10-minute summary of where behavioral economics stands. Second, I want to say, how would they affect policy? I'm going to give some examples, often from work, not from myself. I admire a lot of work of other economists, so I wouldn't want to make this just about my work. And then I want to talk about how do we interpret the role of nudges, of which there is a lot of debate, pro and con, and put some markers on the floor to move forward. Okay, so what I'm talking next comes from a volume that the National Academies convened in the US to review the evidence, I'm reading, regarding the application of insights from behavioral economics to key public policy objectives. And I was one of the members of the committee that included interdisciplinary experts, Robert Moffat, a very distinguished public economist, Alison Butenheim, a researcher on health, and names that if you're an expert in behavioral economics, you've probably heard, but broad enough that we kind of had to come to an agreement. So what's up with behavioral economics and public policy? And so here is something, for some people, an elephant in the room. You might have heard behavioral economics. Yes, of course, for every strange human behavior, there is a new strange bias to explain it. Where is Occam's razor gone? Where is parsimony? It's kind of too easy if for every financial or labor anomaly, we have something else to explain. So is that really what's going on? David K. Levine is a prominent, often provocatory economist, writes, there is a tendency to propose a new theory to explain each new fact. The world doesn't need 1,000 different theories to explain 1,000 facts. And he's right. So are we doing that or are we not doing that? Is behavioral economics a laundry list? It's not. That's our take, my take, the committee. So I'm going to say we sort of single out two main behavioral things that really stand in the way of so many decisions. And then three more. The first one is limited attention. And by the way, what am I showing you? So we took the chapter that came out and we created a word cloud that displays the most commonly appearing words. This is just like, I can't obviously read or summarize the chapter to you in 1 minute. So this is a way to highlight some of the key things. But think about when you receive your Social Security statement, that might say the suggested retirement age is 65. Are you reading the footnotes? When you invest in a mutual fund, are you aware of what the fees are? When you go to the gym or subscribe to the Corriere della Sera or whatever it is, do you know how hard it would be to cancel? Probably not. Because we're humans. We have limited time. We have limited attention to pay. Okay? And that's a completely obvious point. Sometimes people say, you behavioral economists say a lot of obvious things. And in many ways, that's true. That's fine. The important thing is to show what the solid, obvious things imply for a lot of economic behaviors. We don't want to take things that are kind of subtle and nitpicky and maybe true or maybe not. That we have limited attention seems like not a lot of us would probably disagree with that, and we're going to take it to examples. One of them would be, for example, if you want to make people save energy for the environment, well, if they're not paying attention, they're not going to save energy. So we're going to come to some of those examples. So that would be the first one in our mind. The second one, we call it present bias or self-control problems. If you're an economist, you also heard it called as hyperbolic discounting. And what it means is that, from the most trivial example, if you have ice cream in the fridge, it may be a very dangerous thing because you might eat more of it than you like. You might sign up for go to the gym and not go to the gym. It could also mean you would love to save for retirement, but you think, let's do it next week, not now, because it's too costly to do it now. And so this tension between wanting to do things, wanting to get, your homework, your bureaucrat, your tax filing done, but finding it more fun to go out for a walk or see your friends and so on, that's a pretty deep thing of who we are as humans. And again, it's not like economists discovered it, okay, or psychologists, we know it since St. Augustine and going way further about the temptation. But the point is, what happens? It was not in the models economists were teaching 30 years ago, I can tell you this. So what difference does it make? It makes a pretty big difference in a way that is tractable. And then three more things that I'm going to mention more quickly, in part because of time. Incorrect beliefs. You may not know what the Social Security, the pension will pay you, and that may lead to a different decision about retiring. Reference dependence, reference point, like salient things, can affect you with loss aversion if you heard of it. And social norms. So all of us, for better or worse, are affected by what is a perceived good or correct behavior around us. If people say it's really important to pay taxes in time, it's more likely that you're going to be paying them too, holding constant sanctions for it. And so we can come back to that. So there is belief things, there is like preferences, there is like social aspects of this, and there's a lot of things that make being a behavioral economist fun, to be honest, and interesting. Okay, so now that was the first part. Now I should tell you, what do we get out of this? Why does this matter for public policy? Okay, so here's kind of a few examples. Nobel laureate Esther Duflo, together with my colleague Emmanuel Saez and a team of other authors, did an experiment with a company. H&R Block is a company in the US to do tax filing to help you, instead of going to, say, an individual tax accountant. There are companies that, for a fee, they help you do the taxes, okay? And they did this experiment where they wanted to know, can you incentivize people, especially low-income people, to save for retirement? So the tax code, so in the US, there is a part of Social Security that is like a pension, that's like mandatory, but then it's too small really to support you in any way, smaller than the European type Social Security. So you really need to be set extra money aside, okay? Whether, you want to do it also in Europe, but in the US you definitely have to. And those are typically defined contribution plans. What it means is, you set aside $2,000 and you invest it in some fund, and you will earn your return. Now, because a perception is people are not doing enough of this, the tax code puts in incentives for it, which is, to kind of put a match. For every dollar you put, there is an extra amount that the government will put in if you're certain a lower level of income. Okay, so now that take-up is really low. I'll get to that in a second. And H&R Block wanted to study, can we make people invest more for retirement? Which in general we think is a good thing, okay? Because many people tend to get to retirement having saved not enough. So what H&R Block did, some people just reminded the tax filer, hey, do you know you could save for retirement in this IRA, which is just a way to save. And then two other groups got told, not only could you do that, but for every dollar you put, you'll get a 20% match. $1 goes in and $1.20 goes to the IRA, or even $1.50. Now that's a very good return. You're getting 20 or 50% like for free, So how much did this increase the participation? This was a randomized trial. If you heard about an RCT or an experiment, there is no endogeneity here because they were randomly assigned. If you were lucky, you got the 50 or 20%. And how much of a difference does it make? It makes a difference of going from, if you see this 2% participation, all the way to 7 to 14, 13.9%. So it like brings it up, nowhere near 100, but still it's like brings it up by a factor about 5, okay, from 2.5 to 13%. So in this setting, people are paying attention because somebody is telling them, hey, they're filing taxes, there is a human in front of them. Okay, so now keep these numbers in mind, going from 2 to 13%. There is a similar thing in the tax code. It turns out in the tax code, if we all were Homo economicus and knew it all, the 15,000 pages of it by heart, we would know that if we earn below $30,000, we have, for every dollar we put in the savings, it gets doubled. It's 100% match. You put $1, it becomes $2. I mean, that's really a remarkable match. But if you earn $30,000 and $50, you're just barely above, that match goes down to 25%. You put in $1, it becomes $1.25. Okay? So that's actually a bigger difference than the one in the previous experiment. And so the question is, how much do people respond to it? So here, it's not a formal experiment. It's, as Sarah said, a natural experiment in a way, a regressionist continuity, if you will, comparing people that earn a little less than 30,000 and a little more than 30,000. Do they have quite different retirement participation? And the answer is no. There is a 1 to 2 percentage point difference, really tiny. Before, we said that there was a 10 percentage point increase, and here it's only a 1 percentage point increase. Let me just say it in the word that humans would understand. Of course people don't respond to what's written in the tax code. How are they supposed to know that if you're below or above 30,000, your match to retirement is 100% versus 25%? Okay? And if you tell them in person, you explain it, they respond 10 times as much. Okay? But the point of it, though, is, well, if people, of course, don't know, why do you put it like that? What's the point of designing rules that nobody knows about? Right? So, one way to say this, if you're homo economicus, that's a totally fine way to do it. People should know about it, and they will know about it. Well, no. People don't pay attention, they don't know. But the point is, basically nearly nobody pays attention. That's like how little the response is, whereas if you tell them in person, they're responding to it. So this is kind of just an example, and this is basically saying this particular program to encourage retirement saving by low income is entirely ineffective. Okay? Maybe it was meant like that. Maybe it was designed as window dressing, I don't know. But the point of it is, what makes it ineffective is people don't know about it. That's inattention at work. Okay, so there is a number of related papers that I'm going to go quick about, but people may be inattentive to taxes too. But let me talk about, one of the big challenges of our time is global warming. Okay, so we're seeing among economists, I'm sure in other fields, a huge growth in the number of people that want to study environmental economics. You know, how do subsidies, taxes, prices, how do we make sure that people use energy in an efficient way to lower the impact of CO2 and SO2, etc. on global warming? Okay, so one of the ways could be the following. One way is, well, let's just raise the price of electricity and natural gas. But kind of a fairer way, in some sense, could be, we're going to give you some electricity at a relatively low price, and then it's going to go up. So if you use a basic, it's not going to be too expensive. But if you sort of use a lot of water, a lot of natural gas, the marginal price, the price of the extra unit of electricity, energy, natural gas, will cost more and more. And the idea is to say, it's fine if you use a little bit. We don't want to, but if you use more and more, you're going to have to pay quite a bit for it to incentivize you to save. Now, the problem is, if that's the marginal price, that's only going to work if people understand it, okay, or respond to it. And so this researcher, Koichiro Ito, is a Berkeley graduate at Chicago, compared two utilities with houses near a border, and one, basically, the blue one, starts off lower, but the marginal price climbs really high. And the red one instead, as something closer, starts higher, but then it's kind of closer to flat. And then ask which of the two is saving energy more. And obviously, there is variation in how much we're using before. To identify this, let me give you the bottom line. People have no idea of that step schedule. Surprise again, basically people respond to the average. They have some average sense of how much electricity costs. Okay? But again, the point here is that marginal tax schedule, like the marginal tax rate keeps increasing. That one was meant to exactly discourage the high users. It's not working. Forget it. Right? If we're going to do that, let's have some way. So electricity, therefore, now are moving to things like when the price of electricity is really high, they send you a text message. They know they can't do it all the time because otherwise people tune out. But the place where I come from in California, the days when it's really hot, there's such a spike in electricity demand that they might need to shut down electricity for some consumers. To avoid that, just 2 or 3 times a year, they'll send you a text message to alert you to this, and then it's, people respond to that. But they're not going to respond to that curve because they're not aware of the curve. So part of the point is, if we want to design, energy and some prices to kind of save energy, and why would you want to do that? In California, I don't know the part here, there are dozens of coal power plants in the US, let me say, that are kept there entirely for the 3 or 4 really hot days a year. So that in those days a year, you don't shut down power when everybody's turning up their air conditioning. So if you could say, if everybody could lower their consumption a little bit, we wouldn't need to have those incredibly polluting and very costly coal power plants active. So the difference that this can make is kind of pretty big, but people need to respond to it. Okay, so that's this would be behavioral economics means environmental economics. Okay, Self-control. Okay, and let me check that. Okay, we're good. So on self-control, let me talk about everybody's favorite activity, filing taxes. Okay? So many encounters with the bureaucracy are like, you get this form, it's got many places you need to fill, it's written in language that we can barely follow, and it's long, and you know, all of those things, okay? We do not want to do that. We really dread it, but the question is how much? Like, what would be, how important would it be to simplify? For example, to have taxes automatically filed for people that have a simple tax profile. That happens in some countries, okay? So, Youssef Ben-Sarti, who was a student of mine at UC Berkeley, looked at the following thing. You have an income and you can deduct charitable giving or property taxes. So there is some expenses that are privileged from a tax point of view. So if you file them, they will be deducted from the income. So it's to your advantage to do them. But there is also a standard deduction. Let's say the standard deduction is $8,010 in this example. And if your deductions that you have from charitable giving and the other things are $7,000, you don't want to file them. You're better off going with $8,000, okay? Because $8,000 you can get with no effort. But if your charitable deductions are $12,000, then you need to get the receipts. You file them and you say, hey, I did $12,000, and so that way that lowers your taxes more than the $8,000, okay? So now, obviously nobody's filing $6,000, you know, charitable giving, given that $8,000 is automatic. The question, though, is going to be, how many people are filing just above $8,010? You wouldn't file $8,011, right? It takes you all the time to write down for $1 of savings, right? You wouldn't do it. The question is, would you file for $8,500? Would you file for $8,800, right? You start to see. So what this paper looks at is how much mass is missing, how many fewer charitable giving filing are there because people don't find it worth it. They'd rather forego $500, pay $500 taxes, rather than find the receipts. And how do you find it? Is because there is a drop in the distribution of people, in the density that would have been there otherwise. Without going into all the gory details of this, basically what he points to is that, and because, so let's say that finding the receipts takes about 3 hours, okay? Like approximation is reasonable. And Youssef knows their wage because there's their earnings. It turns out that people dislike finding the receipts about 10 times the value of their wages, which is, suppose my wage is $20, it would take me 3 hours. $60 should be about where I'm equivalent to doing it if you think like the economy, it's the value of my time. Turns out it's more like $600 that people dislike it. People really, really hate doing taxes. So this gives us a way to monetize how much people would love to have a simpler bureaucracy. It's a way to give an amount, it's a reveal preferences. If you're an economist, it's a way to measure, and people's preference for simpler thing is really a big deal. Why do I put under present bias? Because this is one of those things that you're gonna go through the pain of filing this form right now to get a tax refund in the near future. So it's like all the dealing with bureaucracy or a difficult employer or forms is all like effort now, benefits later. Kind of like, and so those are the kind of things that we do less of than we might ourselves like. Okay, and one of the kind of most known studies, maybe some of you have heard about it, are default effects in retirement savings. It turns out in the US, where most of the saving is voluntary, in companies where saving for retirement is a choice you have to make, versus the company does it for you and you have to opt out, there is a massive difference, a doubling in the participation in this, even though it's like a simple, again, effort cost of doing it, but defaults really matter. So, and defaults would really matter when both we're a little inattentive, so maybe we haven't read page 27 of the pack of forms that we got when we got hired, and also when we're really averse to immediate costs with delayed benefits. Because of course the benefits are when we're 65, which seems really, really, really far away, but the costs are now. And so again, this sort of relates to inertia effects. And then maybe kind of my last example on this is actually a paper I discussed with in my series of lecture with the Bocconi students kind of earlier in the spring. It's kind of a really interesting study by François Girard and Joana Naritomi on Brazil, where it turns out in many developing countries, when you become unemployed, you not only get an unemployment benefit, like in Italy, like in the US, and so on, which for, say, 6, 9, 12 months, you get some monthly paycheck replacing your earnings from the job. Turns out most of the unemployment comes as a lump sum, as a fixed amount of money. The moment you lose your job, you get a pretty big check because it was somehow money that you had accumulated in case you were going to lose the job. So the difference from the UI benefits is that you get it only one lump sum amount. So now here is the weird thing that happens here. Here is somebody that lost their job. That's not good news for you if you lost your job. So your permanent income, okay, you know, Modigliani Friedman, has just gone down. Turns out how much you have in your pocket has gone up because you just got this severance check, right, for unemployment assistance. Okay, so what should you do? The permanent income guy should not spend that money, right? Because that's what's going to take you through the next month. Who knows how long is it going to take for you to find a job? Precautionary savings. But of course, what is your little bird brain going to do? Our reptilian brain, our present bias brain, is going to have a really hard time not spending that check that we got. So now we have a completely different prediction. The present bias would say consumption would spike up when you get the benefit. The other one would say no, consumption would smoothly decline. This is kind of this is what the benefit is. And what happens is, this is what happens to consumption. That's this graph here, sorry, which means that it's pretty flat, and then you get laid off, you start consuming 30–40% more, you spend all of that extra check, and consumption crashes down. So you did not do a good job of precautionary saving. And actually there's kind of really nice work by Paulo here on crime in Brazil that kind of dovetails to this one with this work too. In other words, why would this matter? How you deliver benefits to people is going to matter. Now, it's not to say sometimes a lump sum isn't useful, but basically assuming that people will do a great job of saving it for a rainy day, the rainy day idea isn't necessarily maybe what the government wants to do, because people may just spend some of his impulse spending and then be in a really tough place. Okay, so, and that's a government choice. They don't need to give it as a lump sum. They could instead give it all. So the choice of annuity versus lump sum and retirement displays into this. So let me just give you the very last one here. This is some work that I've done on reference dependence. Most countries, when you become unemployed, and it's a Western country, there is a level of benefit that lasts for, say, 6–9 months, and then you go on welfare or something like that. But it turns out you could do it a little differently. You could have it be 2 steps. You could have a little higher unemployment benefits initially, then they come down like this red curve, okay, and then until they're finally expired. You could do it in a way that you disburse the same amount of money, but you do it in steps. Now, it turns out if you're reference dependent, this may actually get you to search more for jobs because, yes, initially it's a little higher, the red one, but you also know that it's going to come down. And when it comes down, you sure feel it. And there is the loss aversion from having come down. So there is a model-based prediction that differentiates reference dependence. Of course, I'm not going to go into the details. Turns out Johannes Schmieder and I had worked this out as theory. And then one day we talked to I talked to our colleague Emmanuel Saiz, and he said, oh, you should talk to these Hungarian students because they have this data they can make no sense of. Their data makes no sense. And of course, it made total sense when you looked at it as a behavioral economy. So we teamed up forces and we wrote this paper about the transition in Hungary. And by the way, there is something really interesting here, which is we were looking at these two-step systems everywhere. I had this team of undergraduate arrays. Almost the only places in the world that have it are the Eastern European ex-USSR republics. And for some reason, when they became independent, they all adopted the same plan. There is something really interesting about how governments seems to like copy each other sometime and do think the policy diffusion is an angle that I find fascinating and underexplored. So in any case, when we look at this, the kind of evidence that we see on job search, which is here without going into the detail, is basically the red one, the two-step, actually gets people to exit unemployment more and in a way that you just wouldn't predict with the standard model. So I'm not giving all the detail, but the point is you might want to design benefits differently, not just because of present bias or limited attention, also with an eye to other things like reference dependence. So that's kind of that's sort of my summary here of like the main part of the talk before I turn to nudges. I think I'm scheduled here is the following. And these are all lessons that are, I hope, are common sense, but if you read a textbook about public economics 20 years ago, those either would not be like that or would be like, yeah, you kind of should do this, but our models don't say why. Because the economic models had no room had the homo economicus that saw everything and no problem computing, was forward-looking, and so on. So taxes and benefits need to be clear and salient unless you're trying to shroud them. So if you want people to save energy, to save for retirement, to whatever it is, better make it really simple, really clear to people. The second one, to achieve a welfare goal, you want people to claim benefits, to participate in some programs, to apply to college. You want minorities to, whatever program that is designed for them. You should minimize the effort cost, because even what seems to you like a low effort cost may be a mountain to climb for people. And, we were talking with Tito about this earlier, that in fact, in a world where financial literacy is fairly low, and it's especially low empirically in the kind of populations, with lower earnings that you want to target. If you make things complicated, you're going the wrong way, you're increasing inequality. And behavioral economics has really identified this, that in general, when we find more limited attention and so on, is in the population that instead need to see things, need to hear about things the most. So keeping things very simple and clear is helping everyone, and especially those that need to be helped. The final one is, in designing benefits, keep in mind that just people may not have an easy time consumption smoothing, having the kind of precautionary savings. So designing a policy with an eye to that probably would not hurt. Okay? Now, behavioral economics also calls, in the previous case, is just saying, do all the same thing you would do otherwise, but keep attention to those. But behavioral economics also suggests you might do some things different. The first one, in a way, is the most obvious. Why does it make sense in a world where we're homo economicus to have social security? If you think about it, it's all too obvious to us, but social security means the government is going to take money away from you when you're 20 and give it back to you when you're 65. And you might be like, why'd you do that? Let me make my choices. Okay? I think the strongest argument is because the 20-year-old tends to be short-sighted in a way that they very likely regret at 65 is the main reason why we tend to like pensions. We recognize that it's good to have a commitment device. It's good to have Odysseus tied to the mast. Okay, and so really it's a little harder otherwise to give an explanation of why you would have a social security as opposed to like have incentives. So even in the US, there was immense pushback when there was an effort to fully privatize social security, in part because people realize that this is, they sort of need a help to get around what maybe we think we are self-control problems. The other things are There are forms of taxation like alcohol and tobacco and even taxation of sodas more recently that largely make most sense if you think not only of externalities, I smoke and make others sick, but also internalities, like the government kind of wants to push you to smoke less, and you know, partly they'll pay your health costs and so on. But so those are motives that people were kind of fully rational. The government may not internalize the same way. Or also mandates for energy efficiency, saying incandescent light bulbs cannot be sold anymore. You're like, why? Well, maybe because people would procrastinate replacing them, and with an eye to global warming, we kind of need to switch faster to CFLs and more energy-saving bulbs. So same policy, but administered in a different way and different policies. So let me end with nudges, the last 10 minutes or so. How many of you have heard of nudges? They're just the ones in the room I'm not going to be able to see, but like, okay, so nudges are basically behavioral twists that don't change incentives and are not paternalistic. So when I'm saying incandescent light bulbs are banned, that's not a nudge. That's like highly paternalistic. Or if I'm saying I'm going to change unemployment benefits, that's not a nudge because I'm changing benefits. But if I'm saying, if I'm sending you a letter to encourage you to do something and I'm rewarding the letter, that could have an impact. So let me tell you a couple examples of nudges that were incredibly successful and a couple that were not, and where that leaves us. So this Sara Bargava, a student of mine, and Dave Manoli, two Berkeley students, convinced the IRS, the tax agency in the US, for California, to look at the tax form that it was just a tad complicated for people that were eligible for the biggest benefit for welfare, basically, the EITC, which is this negative income sort of credit that incentivizes low-earning people to work, okay? And it can be up to $5,000. The government knows who's eligible because from your tax filing, you have all the parameters to know you're eligible, but cannot give it to you unless you ask for it. It's kind of a crazy thing, right? It should be done automatically, but they can't because they will need to change the law, etc. So what can they do though? They send a letter to people. Imagine the letter is going to be the IRS and very complicated, and like you, maybe you're just, people don't respond to it often. The question is, can you just make a simpler letter? Would it work? You're like, you know, that's a simple thing to do, right? It turns out it has an amazing impact. The share of people that respond with the simple letter to this is 23%, with a complex letter 14%. It nearly doubles the share. This is a very inertial population that already hasn't responded to 4 previous reminders. This is the 5th and final one. So really making it simple, which costs the IRS nothing. In fact, it saves them 1 page. Is like really doubling the share, the response. So that's like thinking about how important is the target. A really big success story. And another one, this is a paper, one of the papers I'm really proud to have published as co-editor at the American Economic Review. It's this great work by Susan Dinarski and others. In the US, several states have these state universities, like the University of California, where I'm at, University of Michigan, where if you are a citizen of that state and your earnings are below a certain level, which is actually pretty high, like say $80,000, you go for free. Tuition, there's no tuition. But do people know that? So what they did is they actually picked especially in areas where there is lower earnings, more minorities, they identified people such that their earnings record and their grades would say if they applied to University of Michigan, they would get in and they wouldn't pay anything. And they told them 4 years of free tuition. That's a clear message if you have one, okay? 4 years of free tuition at the University of Michigan, which is a great university. It's one of the public universities are, you know, like a really proud kind of American story. Now, the control group doesn't get that, but the control group also has that. They just don't get this really clear communication. It turns out this clear communication closes half of the SES gap between low income and high income people in applying to university. It triples the share that applies, like the 2 bar, from 26 to 68%. Just like, it's like one of those things that really makes you proud of the work that your colleague economists do. It's just one postcard. Now, do we know what it is in the postcard? Is it the blue and gold? Is it the, we don't know. We care, but we care even more that this simple thing, something like this can be so effective. It's targeted to people that kind of have a need. You have the information and you get it across, and you can measure the administrative impact, and what an incredible success story. Now, are all nudges like this? Nope. In fact, it's more complicated than that, and then I will end on something that kind of Sarah mentioned in my introduction, but this is work that Elizabeth Linus and Jesse Rothstein, some colleagues of mine did. They based it on the Bhargava-Manoli store designed for the ITC with the simplified form. The only difference is they sent it to people that had not filed taxes. So that's kind of, the people that filed taxes, you knew exactly they were eligible, but this you also know because you know the earnings are really low, but these people were a little more detached. They were maybe the financial literacy, they hadn't even thought of filing taxes, even though they needed to file tax to get a tax refund. They would have earned a tax refund. In this population, simple and complex forms, zero effect. Zero difference. In the other one, it was doubling. So, run one of a program doubling, run 2, zero effect. Now, exposed, you can say, well, it's different populations. That's true, but it's like pretty staggering. That's like, what, are nudges doubling or are nudges zero effect? How many are of each kind? Are we maybe telling the stories of the 2 greatly successful ones, and there is 100,000 tried that were zeros? That's the question. And so this is where I sort of want to end with the work that I've done with Elizabeth Linus with nudge units. And what nudge units are like a kind of a really interesting sociology of science story that after this book was published, Richard Thaler is a great writer, and so is Cass Sunstein, so it was and a great researcher. It was picked up by the UK Prime Minister, Cameron, that decided my whole cabinet has to read it and live by it. And so they created a unit to implement this. And he, as conservative, liked it because it didn't necessarily mean changing benefits or taxes. It could. And then from there, all kinds of governments, right and left and cities, all of the ones on the map, so hundreds of them, adopted it. And so it could be like a city has a problem that people don't pay the garbage tax in time, or they consume too much energy, or they renew the driver's license in person where they could do it online, and they create lines at the driver office. Like it could be small things, it could be big things, but they call on behavioral scientists, behavioral economists, psychologists to help them improve government communication. Now, if you're a firm, that's called marketing. And firms have had marketing departments for I don't know, hundreds of years. Joachim maybe can tell us more. But governments, they're not exactly great at marketing, are they? They're not staffed. This is something that often, didn't exist. So nudge units in a way are, and I mean it positively, you think the marketing part of government communication. Now, here is what's special. Nudge units have been designed to gather evidence on what works. In their mandate is, don't call Richard Thaler and ask him how to rewrite the letter, or Stefano or Sarah, whatever it is. It says, no, we are not confident enough. Run a trial, send to half the people the control, the complicated, and to half the simple, and see what it does. So these nudge units have created a tremendous amount of evidence from randomized trials at pretty large scale, because maybe the whole population of Chicago and so on. So this evidence is sitting there, and I've gone, let's say, briefly to wrap up on how we got to this paper. I've gone to several presentations of director of nudge units that said, our greatest program is this, and the next greatest is this. And I, born economist, raised my hand and it says, what about the average effect, or the 98 other ones? And it's like, oh, that's an interesting question, we don't know. And so it turns out Elizabeth Linus had been working at one of the nudge units and said, we think we can get it. And huge credit to these units. They opened their record and they said, here is all of our data on everything we ran. 126 experiments, 126 trials involving millions of people. And they said, please tell us what we find. A company isn't going to do this because they were, so the governments, in the end, they were sort of really transparent. And so here's what we find. We find that actually these nudges, on average, all of them are pretty effective. They increase the desired behavior, recycling, paying taxes in time, from a baseline of, say, 17, this number here, 17 percentage point, in the control group, to 17 plus 1.39, so say 18.7. So it's an 8% increase, 1.5%, and it's highly statistically significant if you take the ratio 1.39 to 0.3. So they're effective. However, the interesting thing is their effect is about a fifth the effect size of what you read in the literature. Because this 8 number compared to 1.3 is the kind of effect size if you try to find comparable nudges among published papers. And one of the things that we too seem to point to, what is this graph, and I'll kind of wrap up very soon, is among the published papers, what is the worry that kind of Sarah hinted at? The worry is that scientists do really serious work, but we have a really hard time when we find the null, a 0, to publish it. We want to publish it, but it's really hard. And then you spend a lot of effort, and so if those zeros are unpublished, you have to account for them somehow, right? And so that graph is showing how many in the published papers, not in the nudge units where we have everything, the published papers, how many studies are insignificant versus barely significant or more. And a T of 1.96 is statistically significant. So you see there is kind of quite a bunch of them that are barely significant. There's barely any that are not. There's only 3 out of all of them that are not, that are to the left of the bar, that are not significant. So if you think there is a lot of zeros that have been run but not published, that kind of that's going to bring the 8 a lot closer to the 1.3. So that's and so it's sort of an incomplete story here, but the point is, it's so wonderful to have the nudge units, in part because they create this transparent and the ability to study new questions. And one of them that I will finish on is, this is the platform here that Sarah mentioned, where you can predict research results as a benchmark, part of the research transparency. But I will just end with this, which is, this is an example of an experiment run by a nudge unit. The left one was the control group, and the right one is the nudge one. It was simplified. It had a box. It said, this is the amount due. It did make a difference. It increased this bail payments. The question that we ask in this paper is, okay, it worked. Does that mean the CT used it in the next years, or did they go back to the white one? When you find something that works, it's not enough to find that works. You gotta put it to work. You gotta make it happen. And so in this case, this is the form that we're using 5 years later. They did use the pink one that worked better. So in this case, they applied it. So the evidence that was gathered was utilized. It turns out that was only true in our sample 30% of the time. So the adoption of things that work is nowhere near 100%. And so this is kind of where the next step of this is, not only gather the evidence, but what do we do with the evidence for policy? And kind of that's where my story is going to end today. Thank you so much.